After over 40 hours of playtime, I finally finished the main story of Dragon Age The Veilguard, as well as a ton of the game's side content. And I definitely have some thoughts, starting with the combat that is actually way better than I anticipated. Fighting the many Darkspawn, Venatori, and other enemies thrown at you by the escaped Elven Golds feels very good. Attacks and parries feel weighty and satisfying, abilities are varied and feel fun to use, and there is a ton of depth if you factor in all your different passive skills and companion abilities. I actually found myself enjoying the game more on higher difficulties, as it forced me to start playing more tactically instead of hacking and slashing my way through most things with basic combos. I started using my companions a lot more to set up and detonate skill combos. I choose targets more carefully now, focusing down ranged attackers and casters before I deal with the big bruiser type enemies. And I definitely had another look at my skill tree and gear to make sure I was putting out as much damage as possible. Because you're constantly earning new skill points and finding new gear, you always have a steady supply of new tactics or builds to try. Especially the powerful unique items can really change up the game, like this ring I found that gives me a random buff every time I perform a takedown on a staggered enemy. And then there's of course the fact that I only played as a warrior, and there's still 2 other classes to try builds on if I decide to go back for a second playthrough. Each companion also has a class, so rogue, warrior, and mage, with each one having access to roughly the same support skills, as well as one type of status effect they can set up and one they can detonate. So for example, both warriors Tosh and Davrin have access to a taunt, an invulnerability buff for your player character, and they can set up the overwhelm status and detonate enemies that are weakened. But the buffs they have in their skill trees to empower these skills are different, so you want to have a closer look at these to pick the party members best suited to complement your build, especially on higher difficulties. It's also really cool how quests can impact both gameplay and story, as when completing their personal quest lines, your companions receive a unique passive skill that's dependent on choices you make during their story. It's not always a clear good versus bad choice, but it can result in some very different buffs. Nev in my playthrough has a significant boost to her DPS because I picked a darker path for her, which might not be the best choice if you're using her more as a support. You also get a unique armor set to accompany this passive that gives even more unique buffs to suit a certain playstyle. So while there's totally enough variety between your companions, I wish I could say the same about enemy variety. There's definitely some, especially since you're facing a lot of different factions, but they don't do enough to challenge you in different ways. Each faction has a tanky bruiser type enemy that interrupts your combos, ranged enemies with an AoE attack of sorts, and weaker smaller foes that try to swarm you. So while the Antam and the Venatori look very different, actual combat against them often boils down to the same type of plant. Bosses fall in a similar category, with a few cool unique bosses, but also a ton of mid bosses that are reused often or sometimes reskinned and slightly changed up between factions. It also doesn't help that the camera can sometimes get in your way during these larger encounters, and you usually fight these bosses in large open arenas. An interesting dynamic in the terrain could have definitely helped here to make some of these fights stand out more. I also saw a lot of questions surrounding exploration in the game, and well, I got some thoughts on that too. Real quick, if you liked the video so far, leaving a like would really help me out, and subscribe for more content like this. So yeah, exploration is a bit of a letdown. For starters, some parts of the game have a weird focus on platforming, which while never frustrating, also didn't really feel that enjoyable. These sections are not that long, so not too much of a bother, but they did show up often enough that I found it worth mentioning. But that's not the main problem I have with exploration. Next to helping you in combat, companions can also be used to open up new areas of the map, so recruiting new members and then returning to old areas could result in new loot. Which sounds pretty cool, but it ends up being effectively a key to a lock. Sure, the skills are different, like Lucanus can pull terrain from the Fade, Harding can raise or lower pillars of rock, and Balara can fix broken machinery. But you rarely use them for puzzles or a traversal challenge where you have to chain multiple skill uses together, for example. Most of the time, you just press a button, an animation will play, and you are now able to open a door or pathway that was previously closed. Not to mention that most maps are pretty linear, which makes exploration overall feel uninteresting, although the amount of stuff you can find definitely doesn't leave you lacking for rewards. I also have to give the game credit for the amount of variety in locations, as the different regions of the map have their own unique feel and aesthetic. The dungeon-like zones you enter for main and companion quests add even more more variety to the mix with some very cool set piece locations that really impressed me. But of course, the thing you'll be doing the most is role-playing, as there are a lot of scenes in the game where you make decisions on the type of character you want to be. And this is definitely the part of the game that left me wanting more, especially since it's always been one of BioWare's calling cards. Don't get me wrong, there are some very interesting choices presented to you, both in the main story and in those companion quests I mentioned earlier. Your actions also heavily influence the outcome of the game's final act, so it's not like they're lacking in impact either. The main issue is that most of the big choices don't really change anything about Rook. Sure, you'll always have several options on how to respond to other characters, but even if you're constantly picking the tough or sarcastic options, Rook is still a very nice and empathetic person. There are some reflective moments in your talks with the elven god Solus, who you'll form an interesting bond with after disrupting his ritual at the start of the game and releasing 2 other elven gods he imprisoned centuries ago. But even these reflective moments are all variants of Rook accepting the burden that has been put on them and going out there to save the world. I know we've all been spoiled with the amount of choice offered by last year's Baldur's Gate 3, and I'm not saying every game needs that amount of player freedom. But even in BioWare's own Mass Effect, playing as Renegade or Paragon Shepard felt like a very different story, and more importantly, a very different person. The only real exception to the lack of characterization for Rook is the dialogue you get from your faction background as you pick one of the game's 6 major factions during character creation. I got a ton of cool extra dialogue thanks to being a Grey Warden, which were the only moments where the role-playing made me feel like that was specifically my Rook doing the talking. There is also some great dialogue between you and party members during their personal quest, but I sadly can't say the same about the main quest. Especially when it comes to your quest to save the world, I think the story of Dragon Age The Veilguard is good, but the dialogue, not so much. The story you're presented with has a ton of twists, revelations, and exciting set pieces to keep the adrenaline going. While it gets off to a bit of a slow start after the intro, it definitely picks back up after recruiting the whole gang, and especially the ending has a really great sense of scale and pacing. But the way this story is presented to you in dialogue is often very blatant, with characters pretty much just listing your quest objectives to you before sending you on your way. Each time a new problem arises, the team gets around the table in the lighthouse to discuss their plan. One person will emphasize how difficult this problem is, one will question how they're going to get it done, after which Rook pulls the gang together and someone shares a connection that can help them solve the problem. I didn't keep track of how many times this happens exactly, but it feels like this is how most of the main quests are presented to you. Especially in a game with this many set piece moments, I would have preferred a little more showing over telling. That would also leave room for the characters to shine in these scenes, as they no longer have to communicate the plot to the player and can bring their own unique input and insight to the table. Because there are a ton of interesting things that can happen when you put a ragtag bunch of people together to stop the end of the world, but here everyone just plays along with the plan so easily. There is a short moment where it seems like 2 characters are about to have a conflict, but because you need them to help you save the world, this is sorted out very quickly. Again, compare that to Mass Effect 2, where Jack and Miranda were constantly at each other's throats even after agreeing to work together, and it feels like there could have been more here. It also stands in contrast to how well the individual characters are written, because I feel the writing is the strongest in their personal quest lines. The dialogue feels much better here, as you actually get a glimpse into the lives of your party members. You're also much more invested in the villains, as they pose a direct threat to a person you're becoming friends with. So in general, both the story and dialogue are at their best here. And speaking of villains, that's another part that could have helped me get more invested in the main story. While the game technically starts out with Solus as the main villain, he's quickly pushed into a different role, and the mantle of Big Bad is taken up by the elven gods Elgar'nan and Gillenane. And if you're deeply invested in Dragon Age lore, that's of course super cool, but as characters, they don't hold a candle to Solus. And while he is still there and still very interesting, the villains we got in his place are not strong enough to carry the story on their own. So all in all, I'm very mixed on Dragon Age The Veilguard. I did enjoy most of my time playing the game, as again, I really love the new combat system. But there are definitely parts of it that I expected more of, or some that simply aren't that interesting. Because I like to end things on a positive note, I do think that there's an incredible amount of potential here. In certain endings, seeds are already being planted for a sequel, and if that sequel addresses some of the issues I mentioned mentioned here, I think we're looking at a really good action RPG. As it stands, I think Dragon Age The Veilguard is simply a good game with a decent story that's held back by issues in the dialogue and a lack of role-playing options. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game, so share them in the comments, subscribe for more videos like this, and leave a like if you enjoyed this one. You can also watch our video on mistakes you don't want to make in Veilguard by clicking on the screen. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.